Happy New Year, everybody. And as we turn the calendar on the new year for us in the church, it means we are staring at Epiphany. And Epiphany is a really important day in the life of the church. And when you get around the world, you especially see this because Epiphany marks the visit of the wise men, the day that in many cultures is called Three Kings Day.
Mm-hmm.
And in many cultures, that's when Christmas is celebrated. That's when gifts are given, and you can see the connection to the visit of the Magi. But those are the readings that we're going to look at today as we celebrate Epiphany at Emmanuel. And we're going to start in the Old Testament. Pastor, any words of introduction before we...
I think, this one's really well known around here now ever since you came back from sabbatical. I mean, with your chalking of the door sermon, I think really resonated with people. So that
didn't work so well. 2020 was not the best year, so I don't know if we're going to chalk this year or not. But yeah, chalking the door was a cool
that was a neat one.
Expression of this tradition. Well, let's jump in. We're going to start in Isaiah 60. Pastor, you want to read it?
Absolutely. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. But the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will be seen upon you. And nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising. Lift up your eyes all around and see. They all gather together, they come to you. Your son shall come from afar, and your daughter shall be carried on the hip. Then you shall see and be radiant. Your heart shall thrill and exult, because the abundance of the sea shall be turned to you. The wealth of the nations shall come to you. A multitude of camels shall cover you, the young camels of Midian and Ephah. All those from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense, and shall bring good news, the praises of the Lord.
It is a great Epiphany reading. So as this reading opens up, we're introduced to this language of light.
Mm-hmm.
Arise, shine, for your light has come. And this is often an image or imagery that's used in John's Gospel when he talks about the light that has come into the world, and Jesus even calls himself the light of the world. But when we put this on top of the Epiphany story, the visit of the Magi, you have another very specific arrow pointing to the New Testament, and that is the star that leads the Magi. Any thoughts on the light language here?
Well, I think it's interesting because we're recording this the very week that we were supposed to see what's known as the Bethlehem or Christmas star, and I'm not sure how many of us actually had a chance to see that this week, but it was very cloudy out that sunset. But it was neat to hear that come and then just move into this Epiphany season not too long after. So the impact of this story, in particularly on our culture, continues, and which is really a neat aspect.
So the light language begins this reading. Followed by the contrast to the language of darkness, which we always equate with sin in Scripture. Behold, darkness, sin, death shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. But the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will be seen upon you, and nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising. I'm always amazed at how specifically this Isaiah passage seems to point us to Matthew 2. The language of light, certainly, we think about the Bethlehem star, but also the very specific language about the Magi. And what other language in this reading directs us to the wise men?
Well, I think, the language of darkness can be a little bit. You have these kings coming from the east, and, the Eastern ideology and even maybe theology at the time was certainly not as completely full as it would be once they met the king whom they sought. And so you get this sense of them coming out of the darkness of the limited of their understanding to being fully comprehending and understanding who it is that has come for them, for all people. And so I think there's that sense that leads us towards the wise men in that regards.
Yeah, you move from the imagery of darkness, the language of darkness, to these magi, wise men, bringing good news and the praises of the Lord.
Yep.
So you do see really a neat movement when you apply that to the wise men, to the kings.
Yeah.
I love verse 6, and well, there's great information in all of the verses in this reading, but the picture in 6: a multitude of camels shall cover you, the young camels of Midian and Ephah, all those from Sheba shall come. And I again, applying this to the story of the Magi, which may be a stretch in a sense. I don't think that there is a specific reference back to Isaiah 60 and Matthew. Maybe we'll be surprised when we get to Matthew, but if you think about this idea of a multitude of camels, I think that helps us to think about what practically occurred when the Magi came. It wasn't just 3 camels and 3 wise men. It was a caravan.
Yeah.
You know, and to me that always helps to understand the reaction of Herod and all Jerusalem. They're all upset about this visit, because this is as you mentioned, essentially a delegation from an Eastern power, or a set of Eastern powers that all of a sudden shows up in Jerusalem. Yeah. And I always think that picture in 6 is really helpful in that way. A multitude of camels shall cover you.
And as you describe it, I'm reading in something from our own world a little bit, but if anyone has seen that Disney movie Aladdin, when Prince Ali comes in, this big, grand, pompous circumstance, you get that sense with the caravan, that it's not just 3 people lonely on their camels, but they're bringing gifts, they're bringing servants, they're bringing tents, they're bringing all sorts of things that really, I think, gets depicted even better maybe in a movie like The Little Drummer Boy. Because The Little Drummer Boy, you get that sense of all the things that they're traveling with. It's not just the 3 men based on the 3 gifts idea. So you're right, it does give us that expansive view all of a sudden.
We all have these manger scenes, and you have the token camel, and the wise men and their gifts. But this is a different picture, and I think the Isaiah 60 reading, whether literal or not, in terms of a prophetic word, it helps us to get a better understanding of what that visit would have been. Anything in the Isaiah reading that you want to point out before we move on?
The one thing that stood out to me as we were reading through this was verse 5. Especially, you see the impact of the light upon the person. Then you shall see. So the blindness that the darkness creates is gone. But then it also has an effect that you're radiant. That you kind of, we talk about shining our lights. That's a light that reflects Christ the light. It's not that we create the light ourselves, and that's what radiance really starts to mean, in my mind, that eminence of the impact of God's person, His message, His word upon you and your life creates this radiance. And if you think of like Moses, he's in the presence of God, and he has to put a veil over his face because he truly is emanating God's presence on his very face, and the people can't look at it. I mean, it's an amazing impact. And so that stood out to me a little bit. And then your heart shall thrill and exult. There's just the joy of this fulfillment, or being in this presence that it brings. And so I think that's a neat passage as well in the midst
Very
of all
much
this.
so. Yeah. And again, you can see the connections to the visitors in Matthew 2.
Right.
Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. Well, let's move now into Matthew. We'll probably spend a little more time in Matthew's gospel today. We're in Matthew chapter 2, and if you haven't had a chance yet to download our study guide for this week's study, you can do that now. You'll notice that on the study guide, most of what we cover is in the book of Matthew. A story that we've, again, heard many times and we've seen expressed throughout the Christmas season, but let's listen again as Pastor Schaefer reads the visit of the wise men account.
Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him. After listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them, until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way.
And there you have the story of the wise men. The Epiphany story, 3 kings, and the term kings is an interesting term because that we use that because we're familiar with it, but magi is probably a better term in the sense of who these men were and what they were about. They weren't necessarily political kings. They were of noble state. Mm-hmm. And yet really, and I don't know, Pastor, if you've got any background on this to share, but I've almost heard about these magi in terms of like astronomers, those who study the skies, and I don't know all of the ins and outs of that.
I think that, some of that leads us and comes from some of the ideas that we have from the Old Testament encounters with some of the people of the East, like
yes.
When the Persian government's in charge, in the time of Daniel and things like that.
Very good.
You get the sense of that some of the wise men that the king keeps on hand as retainers almost are those that do dabble in things like astrology or some dark arts, magic, things like that. You think of even Egypt to an extent has that same sense. Mm-hmm. And they're not that uncommon in the king's court because they were practiced and well-versed in things that could have an impact and, looked intimidating and powerful. So certainly that makes sense to have that concept in mind.
Very good. And so that helps us understand the sign that they see, mm-hmm. The phenomenon that draws them, and that's what we hear in verse 2. We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. That's not something you do lightly or without some larger sense of
exactly
the way the heavens work. So these magi, wise men, show up in Jerusalem. And I think this is a fascinating study on how the story of Jesus' birth is set in human history, mm-hmm. and also subject to the political powers, the social constructs mm-hmm. that existed in the time of Jesus' birth. And that's where I think the Isaiah 60 is helpful, because what you get a sense of, especially when you look at verse 3, is that this is almost a scandal, this visit. And when Herod heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And so he calls his cabinet together. He says to the chief priests and scribes, where is the Christ to be born?
Right.
And that tells you also a couple of things about Herod. What would you say about that question that he asks?
I think that, one, you see Herod is not a faithful Jew in the sense that he's not aware of these promises, and not chapter and verse type of deal, but this
Right.
idea of the Christ probably is something even new to him too, because the sense that we get about Herod from this account and from other accounts is it was all about Herod.
Yeah.
And if anything was going to impede on his ability to reign and rule, whether that was a spiritual king, a physical king, anything like that, he had no time for that.
Yeah.
And so you get that sense right away that while he knew where to go, that's great. He himself doesn't seem to be one that was awaiting and expecting this long promised Messiah. So
I love that. And so I think you picked up on some really important themes here, and one of them is Herod's ruthlessness.
Mm-hmm.
In the note sheet that you downloaded for this week's study, there's on question 4, there's a note from the Concordia Study Bible that Herod had murdered several family members when he felt his power was threatened. So he was a bad guy, and so that you kind of get a sense of when Herod the Great, this is the father, different Herod than we see in the account of Jesus' passion.
Mm-hmm.
But Herod the Great, when he gets upset, everybody gets upset.
Mm-hmm.
And you also see, as Pastor said, kind of the true identity spiritually of Herod the Great. He was appointed by the Roman Senate, took power in around 40 BC, and truly didn't understand Jewish theology or custom. Everybody knew the prophecy about Bethlehem. I mean, this was not a hidden thing. And I almost think it's comical that he has to ask, but it shows you who he is and what he's concerned with. And that is in every way, as Pastor Schaefer mentioned, power.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely.
And that leads us then to the next actions of Herod. How does he express this lust, thirst for power?
Yeah, so he's very devious in his way about going about it. And first, I think you look at verse 7. He summons the wise men secretly to find out when they first saw the star. And we get the reason for that later on, because he all of a sudden goes about and decides that I'm going to destroy the children within this time frame.
Yeah.
And so for him to find out that is a significant detail. And then you see him say, all right, remember to report back to me. I want to worship him too.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your work kind of idea. I will come in after you and, worship as well. As we see, if you go, to verse 16 of the same chapter, things change quite quickly. And you see that not only is he manipulative, but he is also very furious and angry. So you have a man that's certainly, like you said, is power driven, and nothing gets in the way of that power.
So the story of the killing of the innocents, beginning in verse 16, is the ultimate illustration of kind of the depth of depravity that we see in Herod. As he has all of the male children in Bethlehem, or in the region of Bethlehem. He has them executed, and I remember watching the classic Jesus of Nazareth film with my parents when I was a kid, and I mean, this was just a horrifying scene, and nothing, you never see actually the killing of a child, but you see the shadow of the Roman soldier unsheathing his sword, and the screaming, crying of the mothers. I mean, it's just one of the most jarring, shocking accounts in Scripture. That's the guy we're dealing with.
Right.
And I doubt, the Magi, the wise men would have known this. They were warned in a dream not to return to Herod, so God intervenes and does the same thing with Mary and Joseph as they are instructed to flee to Egypt in the next section. But maybe the one other thing I want to touch on before we we close for today. And there's a lot of significance in the gifts. You saw that reflected in the Isaiah 60 reading. There's also some pragmatic information about the types of gifts that are given. But the setting for this is, I think, important, and this is another thing that we, because of our cultural interpretation of the Christmas story, we sometimes connect the wise men and their visit with the journey to Bethlehem of the shepherds on Christmas Eve, and you're really dealing with two very distinct occurrences. One of the ways we know that this wasn't the same night is because of what you had mentioned earlier, that Herod asks, what time did you see the star rise? When did you see the star rise, and begin to follow it? Understanding from Herod's perspective anyway, that that would have indicated the birth of the child. And so when Herod actually makes his decree to execute the children, it's the children in this window of birth to two. And then you see the term house used. Any comment on that?
Sure. If you remember, from the moment that Joseph and Mary finally get to Bethlehem for the census, the famous line, "There was no room in the inn." And so a lot of times, tradition has them, in a cave. Sometimes people think of a stable, something that was really built for animals, that type of shelter. And now that we hear that there's a house involved, certainly we see that they've probably moved up to a better residence now that people have left after the census. I mean, that makes some logical sense based on the language used.
Very good. So you have a few things that might go against the cultural picture that we've created on the perfect Christmas Eve nativity, and yet this is an incredibly important part not only of the Christmas story, but of the story of salvation. And we see all kinds of important details that would inform that part of the story. The gifts that are given allow the family to go into Egypt. If you remember the story of the Exodus from Egypt, when Moses leads the people out, they take with them the plunder, the gifts,
spoils
from the Egyptians. And now they again here are equipped with the resources they need as they go back into Egypt. Just some real interesting connections to the Old Testament. Anything, Pastor, anything else that you see here before we?
I think, we've highlighted this, but maybe we just need to say it even more directly too. When you talk about the impact of salvation on this again, or, that we see coming from this, is that as you've heard us allude to, this is, again, the emphasis that Christ is for all people. And that's one of the biggest parts that you hear in Isaiah 60. You hear it here in Matthew 2 with these men from the east coming who are not Israelites, uncircumcised probably, all of that. And then you get that even in our Ephesians reading too that's on for this week, this emphasis that God's ministry is for both Jew and Gentile.
And that reading from Ephesians 3, we're not going to necessarily dig into that in a deep way here, but it's exactly what Pastor is saying. Paul there refers to this revelation, this epiphany, that Jesus is for all, as the great mystery of the gospel. He says the mystery which has been kept hidden for ages past has now been revealed in Jesus, and that mystery is that the Gentiles are heirs also. And that includes us, certainly includes us, and it probably includes most of the people who are watching this Bible study today. So that's the larger meaning behind Epiphany. That is why in so many cultures Epiphany is celebrated as the giving day, because that's when Jesus is revealed as Savior of the world. So from here we will press on, and we will look forward to moving into this new church here in a special way. God bless you, and we'll see you real soon.